It was a quiet Tuesday evening in northern Tasmania, 25 April 2006, Anzac Day, a day to remember heroes, the fallen, and the stories of survival that shaped a nation. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and families returned home from ceremonies, in the mining town of Beaconsfield, something was stirring far beneath the earth. The Beaconsfield gold mine had long been one of the lifebloods of this small community. Generations had worked its depths, extracting wealth from the hard Tasmanian rock, proud of their resilience and skill. But on that night, nature had other plans. At exactly 9:26 p.m., the earth trembled. It wasn't a roar, not like an explosion, more like a deep, muffled groan. A low rumble that lasted only a second or two, barely noticeable on the surface. A small tremor, later measured at magnitude 2.3. But down below, nearly a kilometer underground, that tremor triggered something devastating. It hit without warning. Inside the mine's lower tunnels, 3 men, Brant, Webb, Todd Russell, and Larry Knight, were nearing the end of their shift. They were in a vertical mining cage, working in what's known as the 925 level, around 925 meters beneath the surface. That's over 3,000 feet down. Deeper than the tallest building in the world is high. They were experienced, tough, calm under pressure. This was just another day, another shift in a hard but familiar world. And then, in an instant, it all changed. A sudden explosion of dust, a deafening crack, and then silence. The rock around them had burst. Under the immense geological pressure, a mass of stone had fractured and collapsed, cascading like a stone avalanche. Later, it would be described as a seismic event, a burst of stored energy that caused tons of rock to shift and drop. If this story moved you, if you believe in real courage, real people, and real survival, subscribe now. This is just one of many true stories that deserve to be told. Hit that button, join our community, and never miss the moments that remind us what it means to be human. When the dust began to settle, Brant Webb stirred. His head throbbed. His helmet was gone. Blood trickled from a cut near his eye. The world was black, and he couldn't move his legs. Beside him, Todd Russell coughed violently, spitting grit and dirt. His ears were ringing, but he was alive. Dazed, he reached out into the darkness. Somewhere above them, in the tangle of twisted steel and rock, was their colleague, Larry Knight. "Larry?" Todd's voice echoed in the silence. "Larry, you there?" No response. They tried again and again, only silent. They both knew what it meant, even if they couldn't yet see him. Later, they would learn that Larry had died instantly. A section of the cage had crushed him during the collapse. He never had a chance. But Brant and Todd, they were alive, trapped, injured, but alive. They didn't know it yet, but they were entombed in a 1.2-meter-high pocket, barely big enough to sit upright, surrounded by rubble, twisted steel mesh, and total darkness. No idea where they were. No idea if anyone else was alive. No way to call for help. No idea if help was even coming. The first minutes were chaos. "Are you okay?" Brant whispered, his voice hoarse. "I think, yeah. You?" Todd replied. "Alive. That's something." Their hands reached in the dark. They were about half a meter apart, close enough to talk, to keep each other sane. They touched boots to confirm. "We're not alone," Todd murmured. "We've got each other." They assessed what they had. Not much. Each man had a small miner's belt with water bottles, a couple of protein bars, a headlamp, smashed. Brant's lunchbox had survived, containing a muesli bar, a few lollies, and a bit of canned fruit. That would be dinner, and breakfast, and possibly everything else. They were wedged in tightly, but not crushed. The cage's twisted steel had created a fragile cocoon, just enough space to breathe. Above them, the mine had gone into emergency mode. A head count was underway. As time ticked on and Knight, Webb, and Russell failed to reappear, the alarm was raised. Rescue teams scrambled. But the extent of the collapse was only slowly becoming clear. They reached the site and were horrified. Massive rock falls, crumpled infrastructure. The area was far too unstable to access directly. They began working outward from safer tunnels, trying to triangulate the exact position where the cage had stopped. But it would take days, Days of digging, blasting, and uncertainty before they would know anything. Below ground, Brant and Todd waited and hoped. They talked a lot about their wives, their kids, about football, about the last time they saw Larry Knight laughing on the job. They told jokes, whispered prayers, and fought against the creeping terror in the dark. The heat was relentless. The temperature in the pocket hovered around 35 degrees, 95 degrees, with high humidity. Sweat rolled off their faces. There was no change of clothes. They began to stink. Their skin itched. They were covered in dust. Time had no meaning. "Is it night?" Brant asked once. "Could be morning for all we know," Todd said. "Could be next week." They agreed early. They had to keep each other sane. "If I lose it," Brant warned, "you knock me out." "Same," said Todd. "No madness down here." They marked time by routine. Drink a sip, chew a little, sleep and shift, stretch when they could, conserve energy, conserve hope. By day 2, their food was gone. On the surface, rescue workers were growing more desperate. The mine owners, Beaconsfield Gold, worked with Tasmania police, SES, and local miners to map the collapse zone. They started deploying geophones, devices that detect vibration, into the rock. They began to listen. On day 5, something happened. Just before midnight, one of the geophones picked up a rhythmic tapping. 3 taps, pause, 3 more, then silence. Rescuers held their breath. They tapped back, the same pattern, and again they received a reply. It was the first confirmation that someone was alive. Now the operation shifted into overdrive. They drilled a 30-meter-long borehole, just big enough to send down a camera, a microphone, and a small tube. It took hours of careful precision. The rock was unstable. Another collapse could kill everyone. And then the camera made contact. They saw them. 2 gaunt faces, covered in dust, eyes wide, tired but alive. They were sitting, wedged inside the remnants of their crushed cage, waving slowly to the lens. Rescue workers erupted in cheers. But the job had only just begun. Through the tiny pipe, they sent down glucose solution, water, and messages from loved ones. Brant and Todd cried as they read the first notes. "Your kids love you. Don't give up." Everyone's praying. They hadn't known. Not until that moment. They hadn't known anyone was even looking for them. Now, they knew the world was watching. The pipe also allowed for 2-way communication. They talked with paramedics, with engineers, with psychologists. Every hour mattered, but so did safety. Rescue teams now had to drill a rescue tunnel, long, narrow, and precise, that would cut across hard quartz and unstable rock. A single miscalculation could bring it all down. It would take another 8 days. And for Brant, Webb, and Todd Russell, it would mean another week in the dark. They didn't complain. Not once. They were miners. They knew the risks. They trusted the team above. But inside that void, the emotional toll deepened. Brant began hearing music in his head. Phantom sound. He whispered lyrics to himself. Todd thought he saw shapes in the darkness. Both men cried quietly at times, but they never gave up. Every day the pipe brought new comfort. Broth, medicine, a tiny iPod with messages from their children. They listened to Jimmy Barnes. They listened to the sound of their daughters saying, "I love you, Daddy," and they waited. "I'm going to walk out of here," Todd whispered one day. "Yeah," Brant replied, "and I'm going to order a steak the size of a car bonnet." The confirmation of life on day 5 changed everything. Above ground, in the windswept town of Beaconsfield, hope exploded like a shockwave. What had begun as a grim body recovery operation now became a rescue mission watched by the entire country. Flags flew at half-mast for the loss of Larry Knight, and beside those flags, candles now flickered with the hope that Brant Webb and Todd Russell would emerge alive. For the first 5 days, they had been ghosts, imagined, theoretical, trapped maybe, alive maybe, and then 3 taps, 3 more, and a reply. Inside their tomb, Brant and Todd had already made peace with dying. They had already rehearsed their goodbyes in the dark. Todd had decided quietly that if food ran out, if the air grew foul, if the days turned to weeks and the silence remained, he would try to dig. try to do something, anything, even if it killed him, because the idea of doing nothing was worse. But now, everything was different. They weren't dead, and they weren't alone. Through the narrow borehole drilled by the rescue team, salvation had arrived in the form of a plastic tube barely wider than a man's thumb. It delivered oxygen, glucose solution, water, and, perhaps most powerful of all, words. Words from above. You are not alone. We're coming. Hold on. They cried when they heard their names spoken aloud. That was the moment it became real. Someone was speaking directly to them. People knew they were alive. People cared. People were fighting to reach them. And so, the rhythm of their lives changed again. Instead of surviving on instinct and will alone, they now survived for the people waiting outside that mine. They owed them. They owed Larry. They owed their kids. They couldn't die now. The rescue team was led by some of the most experienced engineers and miners in the country. Their mission: create a tunnel from a nearby chamber into the tiny space where Brant and Todd were trapped. A tunnel large enough for a man to crawl through, but narrow enough to avoid further collapses. It would have to travel 16 meters through rock harder than granite. That kind of quartz is known to destroy drill bits in minutes. And all of it had to be done with absolute precision. One wrong move, and the entire void could collapse, killing the two men they were trying to save, and possibly the rescuers too. It was like defusing a bomb in the dark, with lives ticking away behind the wall. They began by expanding the borehole into what they called the communication tunnel. Through this pipe, they now sent food, painkillers, small comforts. The miners received electrolytes, vitamin drinks, and eventually, one of the strangest requests in rescue history: iPods. Yes, iPods. Because even in the darkness, even with thirst, hunger, and uncertainty gnawing at their sanity, they needed more than physical survival. They needed their minds to stay intact. Music brought them something approximating normality, a reminder of life. Jimmy Barnes, Midnight Oil, Crowded House. The first time Todd heard his daughter's recorded voice saying, "I love you, Daddy," he pressed the iPod against his chest and cried. He didn't try to hide it, not from Brant, not from himself. Above ground, the rescue was becoming a marathon. Shift after shift worked around the clock. They used diamond-tipped drills, compressed air, manual tool. It was loud, hot, dusty, and incredibly dangerous. Every miner knew someone who died underground. That's part of the unspoken contract when you go down the shaft. The Earth doesn't make promises, and it doesn't apologize. So each team member carried that weight, that risk, that fear. Every few hours they'd stop drilling, listen through the pipe, and talk to Brant and Todd. They joked, they gave updates. They avoided saying just how hard and how slow the work really was. And Brant and Todd, they played their part. They kept their routines, made lists of things they'd do when they got out, joked about ordering massive steaks, cold beers, days at the beach. But under the surface, cracks were forming. Brant started hallucinating more frequently. Once, he saw lights flickering in the rock. Another time, he imagined a dog curled up next to him. He knew it wasn't real, but it didn't stop his brain from playing tricks. Todd kept whispering prayers. He wasn't a religious man, but down there, prayer wasn't about doctrine. It was about rhythm, about silence, about holding the thread of hope in his hands and not letting go. They also grew physically weaker. Despite the energy drinks and nutrients, their muscles began to atrophy. Their skin became clammy. They were unable to stretch fully. They had to shift constantly to prevent pressure sores. Sweat had soaked their clothes. The smell was unbearable. But to them, it was life. "You good?" Todd would ask. "I'm still here," Brant would reply. That became their mantra. Not, "I'm okay." Not, "We'll be fine." Just, "I'm still here." It was enough. As the rescue tunnel inched closer, the psychological pressure mounted. Every inch deeper into the quartz risked instability. The rescuers had to blast. Small, precise explosions with charge packs no bigger than a fist. But even that could be deadly. Each time a blast went off, the men below felt it. Dust would trickle down. The cage would vibrate. And for a moment, just a moment, they would freeze. Was this the one that would bury them? One night, after a particularly strong blast, Brant whispered, "If that wall cracks, we've got 5 seconds to say goodbye." Todd didn't respond. He just gripped Brant's hand in the dark. News of their survival had now gone international. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, all broadcasting live updates from the small town of Beaconsfield. But this wasn't just a media circus. It was a shared human event. Messages poured in from around the world. One woman from the United States wrote, "I watch the news every morning with tears in my eyes. Please tell them they are loved." A school in Sydney sent hand-drawn cards from children. One said, "Dear Mr. Miners, I hope you get out soon. I don't know your names, but I know you are very brave." The rescue site was now lit 24 hours a day. Cameras set up, police cordons. But through it all, the miners, the real miners, kept working. Underground, there was no glory, no spotlights, just sweat, dirt, and steel nerve. On day 10, the rescuers broke through into a small cavity. Not yet the final destination, but close. So close they could almost hear the men. But still more quartz, more steel, more silence. Brant and Todd were now counting minutes instead of hours. They knew it had been many days. But how many? 11? 12? Todd asked for the time. A rescuer's voice came down the pipe. "Mate, it's May." May. They had gone into the earth in April. That hit them hard. They weren't just missing days anymore. They had missed part of their lives. The idea of the outside world continuing without them was disorienting. It made them realize just how far away they still were. Brant started imagining the rescue going wrong. Not from pessimism, but from preparation. He told Todd, "If they break through and there's a spark and gas and boom, that's it." Todd just nodded. Not because he agreed, but because he'd had the same thought. At night, or what felt like night, they'd lie still and listen. The pipe hummed faintly. Somewhere above, people were still working, still digging. They were still here. "I want to see the stars," Brant whispered one night. "Me too," Todd replied. "First thing, I want to feel the wind, real air. No noise, no lights, just night and steak." They laughed and then went quiet. They didn't need to say more. On the surface, the rescue teams were making progress, but each inch was harder than the last. The quartz was brutal. Even diamond-tipped drill heads wore down. Tools broke. Tempers flared. Men collapsed from exhaustion. But they didn't stop. Each blast, each turn of the drill, each shift of dirt. It wasn't just mining anymore. It was a fight for life. And by the 13th day, they were ready. Almost. The final stretch, just 30 centimeters of rock between life and death, would take them another full day to penetrate. They needed to do it by hand, slowly, carefully. No mistakes. No noise over the pipe that might raise false hope. And so Brant and Todd waited. One final day, one final test. They didn't sleep much. They just held on to the voices. They just kept whispering their names. They just kept saying, "We're still here." By now, the nation was holding its breath. The rescue tunnel had reached the edge of the void. There was rock, just 300 millimeters, between the end of the rescue chamber and the space where Brant Webb and Todd Russell had survived for nearly 2 weeks. 2 weeks of darkness, of sweat, of waiting, of not knowing if they would ever leave the mine alive. And now they were on the threshold, but there could be no rush. Every rescuer knew this was the most dangerous moment of all. The final breach had to be done by hand, in silence, in control. Because one mistake, a sudden rush of air, a dislodged boulder, a tremor, could collapse the pocket and crush the very men they were trying to save. The plan was simple, but brutal. Go slow, go quiet, break through with handheld tools. No machinery, no drills, no noise. One rescuer, Pat Ball, would lead the team into the void. He was a veteran, calm, methodical, trusted. Around him, silence reigned. The operation began in the early hours of Tuesday, May 9th, 2006. 15 days had passed since the rockfall. Inside the cramped chamber, Brant and Todd had been given a warning the night before. "We're very close. Tomorrow could be it." They didn't sleep much. Neither of them spoke about it, but both had the same thought. What if something goes wrong now? Brant lay with his eyes open in the darkness. feeling the vibration of faint movements in the rock. It was real. The end was real. "I think I hear them," Todd whispered once. "They're coming," Brant said, voice barely audible. "They're bloody coming!" It was just past midnight when the final chiseling began. The last slab of rock separating the men from their rescuers was cold, unyielding, dense quartz. It had crushed tools for days, but now it had to give way. In the tunnel, rescue worker Steve Saltmarsh helped Pat Ball position his tools. Every chip, every scrape, every crack of stone was like surgery. And with every small piece removed, the sound of life from the other side grew clearer. Then, the moment. A gloved hand pushed through the final gap. Light from a helmet torch flooded into the void. A rescuer's voice came through, breathless. "Brant? Todd? You there, boys?" Silence. And then, "Bloody oath, we're here." The first human contact in 15 days. Pat Ball peered through the hole, shining his light into the darkness. What he saw stayed with him forever. Two men, skeletal from hunger, covered in dust and sweat, eyes wide and gleaming, smiling, alive. Webb and Russell blinked, shielding their eyes. The rescuer laughed. "You blokes ready to get out of here?" Brant cracked a smile. "You got beer out there?" "I think we can manage." The opening wasn't big enough for a man yet. They had to widen it, carefully, with small tools and extreme control. The air in the void was still unstable. They feared a backdraft, so they inserted a breathing mask connected to a compressed air line, handing it to Brant first. He refused. "Give it to Todd," he said. "He's got kids." Todd shook his head. "We both go. We both breathe, or not at all." They shared the mask. They waited as the tunnel was widened. Every minute felt like an hour, but this was happening. It was real. Outside, families gathered behind security fences. Dozens of media teams were stationed outside the mine. Helicopters hovered. But the rescue site remained eerily quiet. This was not a show. It was sacred ground. By 4:45 a.m., the opening was ready. Brant went first, crawling, slowly, wincing. Each movement strained muscles that hadn't stretched in 2 weeks. But the tunnel held. The light grew brighter. The air got cooler. And then he was out. Not into the daylight yet, but into the rescue tunnel, into arms, into life. Todd followed, crawling on hands and knees, eyes fixed forward. When his hands reached the edge of the tunnel, he gripped it like a man climbing out of his own grave. Behind him, the pocket that had held them for 14 days, the tomb of twisted steel and black silence, lay empty. The rescue team helped them sit, gave them water, let them breathe. They were thin, pale, dirty, but grinning. They had done it. At 5:58 a.m., they emerged from the lift cage at the surface of the Beaconsfield mine. Brant Webb and Todd Russell, buried alive for 2 weeks, walked out on their own feet into the cold Tasmanian dawn. A ripple of stunned silence gave way to roaring applause. Families sobbed, rescue workers wept, cameramen trembled. One onlooker whispered, "This is a miracle." They waved, not like celebrities, not like heroes, but like men grateful for mourning. Brant's wife, Rachel, ran to him. Todd embraced his wife, Carolyn, and their children. His son clung to him and wouldn't let go. It wasn't just joy. It was something deeper, something cellular. The recognition that life had returned, and then the crowd parted. To one side, a framed photo had been placed. Larry Knight, his death had not been in vain. Brant and Todd both stopped, both touched the photo, and both bowed their heads. They didn't speak of him yet. That would come later. But they knew Larry was part of their story, always. In the days that followed, the two men were taken to Launceston General Hospital for observation. They were dehydrated, malnourished, and exhausted, but fundamentally unbroken. Doctors were amazed. There were no major injuries, no permanent organ damage, just incredible weariness and strength. When reporters asked Todd how they had survived, he said, "We made a pact. We weren't going to let each other go. Not mentally, not spiritually, not for 1 minute." Brant nodded. "We didn't save each other. We just refused to die." The town of Beaconsfield exploded in celebration. Banners lined the streets. Children wrote cards. Bells rang from churches. Neighbors hugged each other in the street. But the story was not just about survival. It was about what humans do for each other when it matters. The mine workers who refused to quit, the engineers who drilled through stone, the nurses who stood ready at dawn, the families who kept vigil in silence. This was not just the story of two miners. It was the story of all of us. Inside the hospital, Brant asked for one thing: a hot shower and a bacon and egg breakfast. Todd wanted his son to sleep next to him. They got both. The world, too, had been changed. For 2 weeks, headlines had carried fear, hope, loss, and now, triumph. News anchors cried on live television. One host said, "They didn't just survive, they gave the country something to believe in again." But even now, the full story had not been told. There were questions to ask, investigations to come. How had this happened? What safety measures had failed? Could Larry Knight's death have been prevented? For now, those questions were suspended, because Brant Webb and Todd Russell, two men from Tasmania, had just walked out of hell, and they had done it with their heads held high. In the raw, cold morning of May 9th, 2006, as the first light spread over northern Tasmania, the mining town of Beaconsfield became more than a place. It became a symbol, a point of convergence for survival, sacrifice, and the collective heartbeat of a nation. Brant Webb and Todd Russell had emerged from the depths of the earth on their own feet, gaunt but upright, like two specters walking out of a war zone. And for a brief, golden moment, there was silence. Not because people didn't know what to say, but because they didn't need to. Everyone who saw them walk out of that mine understood something unspoken. This was not just about rock and drills and rescuers. This was about the thin membrane that separates life from death, and how courage can hold it together. As Brant was led toward the waiting ambulance, he turned to a rescuer and asked with half a smile, "Did we miss the footy?" The man laughed, but his eyes brimmed with tears. Inside the ambulance, they were handed bottles of water and protein drinks. One paramedic said gently, "You'll need to take it slow." Brant leaned his head back against the stretcher. "Mate, everything's slow right now." Todd simply asked, "Can I see my wife?" That moment would come soon enough, but not before they were carefully transported to Launceston General Hospital. Not before every vital sign was checked. Not before the nation let out a collective exhale. In front of television screens across Australia, across the world, people sat in tears. They made it. The phrase echoed in cafes, schools, pubs, and living rooms. Not because it was surprising, but because so much of Australia had emotionally invested in those 14 days. In that mine, in those men. But while celebrations erupted, questions were already stirring beneath the surface. Why had this happened? Could it have been prevented? What about Larry Knight? Even as Brant and Todd were being examined by doctors, a coroner's inquiry was being quietly prepared. An investigation by Tasmania's workplace safety regulators was already underway. And in the background, the operators of the mine, Beaconsfield Gold Joint Venture, were beginning to prepare for scrutiny. Back inside the hospital, Brant and Todd were stable, thin, dehydrated, but miraculously free of catastrophic injuries. Doctors were amazed. It was not luck alone. It was conditioning. Both men were experienced miners. Both had kept their breathing slow, rationed their movement, conserved calories, and held tight to psychological routines that kept panic at bay. When asked what the worst part was, Brant didn't mention hunger or thirst. He said, "It was not knowing if they were coming." He paused. "Once we heard the voices through the pipe, it changed everything." Todd added quietly, "We went to a place most people don't ever see, a place in your head. You learn who you are down there." They stayed in hospital for 4 days. Outside, the media storm intensified. Reporters from London, Los Angeles, and Tokyo were camped on the lawns. Helicopters buzzed above. The world had seen the ending, but now it wanted the details. And as always in survival stories, people wanted heroes. They found them in the two miners, but also in the rescue team. Dozens of volunteers, underground miners, engineers, and explosives experts had worked in shifts around the clock. They had faced rock falls, dust, exhaustion, and danger. They had used drills with millimeter precision. They had done what few believed possible. Rescuers like Pat Ball, Steve Saltmarsh, and John Fahey were hailed not just for their skills, but for their humility. They didn't seek praise. One of them was asked how he felt the moment Brant's face appeared through the breach. His voice cracked as he said, "I'll remember that until the day I die." But there was a shadow cast over the story. Larry Knight, the third man in the cage, the one who hadn't survived. On April 28th, 3 days after the initial collapse, his body had been recovered by a team that risked their lives to do so. His funeral was held quietly, with his family requesting privacy. But as the rescue progressed, his name faded into the background. Now it returned. Why did Larry die and Brant and Todd survive? It wasn't about where he was standing. It wasn't luck alone. People wanted answers, and they were coming. On May 11th, 2 days after the rescue, Tasmania's Premier Paul Lennon announced a comprehensive investigation into the Beaconsfield mine's safety protocols. He praised the courage of the survivors, but added, "There are serious questions that must be asked and answered. Lives were lost. The public deserves transparency." At the same time, Beaconsfield Gold's representatives were making media appearances, expressing relief and pride, but their tone was cautious, carefully scripted. Inside the company, damage control had begun. Safety inspectors had already raised concerns months earlier about the very area where the collapse occurred. A report in February had cited seismic activity as a risk. The mine had taken measures, but clearly they hadn't been enough. Meanwhile, Brant and Todd, though still recovering, were being inundated with media requests. TV networks offered money for exclusive interviews. Publishers offered book deals. Journalists camped outside the hospital. Their families, once living in quiet anonymity, were now surrounded by cameras. Rachel Webb, Brant's wife, made a simple request to a reporter. "Please remember, they're just people, not headlines." Still, the interviews came, carefully managed, coordinated with trauma experts. Because while Brant and Todd were physically intact, the psychological impact of what they'd endured would take time to surface, and even longer to heal. They had lived in a 1.2-meter-high steel cocoon for 14 days. They had eaten almost nothing for 5. They had faced hallucinations, despair, crushing heat, and total sensory deprivation. Now they were being asked to relive it in front of cameras. They did so eventually, but in their own words. In their first press conference, held a week after the rescue, they walked slowly into a packed hall. Brant cracked a joke. "You all look a lot better than we do." Laughter. But behind it, raw truth. Todd's voice trembled when he said, "We thought we were dead. We thought no one would find us." Brant added, "It was dark, real dark, but we had each other." The room went silent. They told the story not to sell it, not to dramatize it, but because they felt a duty to Larry, to the rescuer, to the people who had stayed up night after night hoping. But behind the scenes, they struggled. Brant began having nightmares. He avoided small spaces. The sound of drilling made his chest tighten. One night, he told his wife, "I can still feel the heat, like I'm back there." Todd, always more reserved, began withdrawing. He smiled for the cameras, but at home, he paced. He couldn't sleep. He felt like the world had moved too fast, like the cameras had arrived too early, like he wasn't done being underground. Both men would later undergo trauma counseling. The term post-traumatic stress disorder was whispered, then acknowledged outright. They weren't weak, they weren't broken, but they were human. The town of Beaconsfield erected a memorial, not just for the rescue, but for Larry Knight. A bronze plaque, a simple inscription, "In honor of those who worked, of those who waited, and of the one who did not return." On the anniversary of the collapse, Brant and Todd attended the ceremony. They stood beside Larry's family. No words were exchanged, just hands held, eyes lowered, because some pain has no language. In the months that followed, the mine reopened. Operations resumed, but the workers moved with caution. The laughter underground was quieter. The machinery hum had a nervous edge. Some of the rescuers left mining altogether. Others stayed but never spoke much about those weeks. And Brant and Todd, well, they became national figures. But they didn't want to be statues or slogans. They wanted to work, to live, to raise their kids, to find peace. In interviews, they refused to be called heroes. Brant once said, "I didn't pull anyone out. I didn't save lives. I just didn't give up." Todd echoed it. The real heroes were up top. They didn't sleep. They kept digging. And the truth is, both were right. This wasn't a story of a single man. It was a mosaic, 1,000 hands reaching toward one light, a town that refused to bury its own, a nation that stopped to watch two miners refuse to die. But the deeper legacy, the one that would matter in the long run, was in what came next. Investigations, reform, reminders. Because for every Brant and Todd who walk out of the earth, there is a Larry who doesn't, and that cannot be forgotten. When Brant Webb and Todd Russell emerged from the Beaconsfield gold mine after 14 days in total darkness, they became household names overnight. But fame, unlike stone, has no structure. It comes fast. It crumbles just as quickly. And no one tells you how to carry it when your hands are still shaking from what you've just survived. At first, everything was joy. The town lit up. Media ran non-stop coverage. They were called heroes, survivors, miracles. But inside their homes, away from the flashbulbs, the microphones, the polite applause, they were just two men trying to sleep without hearing rock cracking in the silence, trying to enjoy meals without feeling guilt for the friend who never made it back, trying to return to normal when nothing felt normal anymore. Brant Webb once described it like this: "You don't realize how much you're holding on until you stop. And when you stop, it all comes down at once." The early days were a blur. Medical checkups, PTSD screenings, family reunions, funeral visits. And behind it all, the storm of public curiosity. The world wanted the details, wanted the drama, wanted the heroism, but it didn't want the trauma. The trauma stayed in the quiet moment. When Brant would reach for the light switch too fast and his heart would pound. When Todd would duck under a low doorway and flash back to crawling through quartz tunnels with death just inches above. They didn't ask to be known. They didn't train for the public eye. But now they were everywhere, on morning shows and documentaries, quoted in books, smiling for the camera, nodding politely. But after the lights turned off, Brant would sit with his wife in the hallway because he didn't want to sleep in the dark. Todd started to avoid crowds. He hated elevators. People meant well. But well-meaning questions don't land gently when your mind is still in survival mode. What was it like down there? Did you think you were going to die? Was it a miracle? They tried to answer. But sometimes the truth isn't clean enough for interviews. Because how do you say, "I thought I'd never see my kids again, and I started planning how I wanted to die"? How do you say, "I hallucinated a dog. I named it. I talked to it"? How do you say, "I still smell the dust when I close my eyes"? So instead, they said, "We were lucky. We had each other. We just didn't give up." And those things were true, but they weren't the full truth. Meanwhile, the investigations into the collapse deepened. Tasmania's Workplace Standards Office, federal mining safety bodies, and independent consultants were brought in to examine what had gone wrong at Beaconsfield. They interviewed engineers, reviewed seismic records, examined structural blueprints. What they found disturbed many. Yes, the 2.3 magnitude seismic event was unpredictable, but warnings had been issued months before. Concerns had been raised about that specific area of the mine. Previous tremors had occurred. Workers had reported odd vibrations. There were even documents indicating that emergency plans were outdated. The mining company, Beaconsfield Gold Joint Venture, maintained that it had followed all required procedures. They expressed regret, sorrow, and support for the survivors. But the pressure mounted. Some insiders accused the company of pushing too hard, too deep, and too fast. That production was prioritized over precaution. That warning signs were brushed off as just another shift underground. Public anger simmered. Talkback radio hosts asked why Larry Knight had died. Why Brant and Todd had no real-time emergency communication gear. Why a section of tunnel that deep hadn't been reinforced with more modern stabilizers. The company issued press releases. Politicians made statements. But the grieving families, especially the Knights, were left asking questions that no boardroom could answer. Brant and Todd avoided commenting publicly on the corporate side of things. They said they weren't engineers, they weren't regulators, but privately, they worried. Worried that if nothing changed, this could happen again. Still, life moved on. And as it did, Brant and Todd faced a new battle: identity. Because how do you go back to being a regular miner when the world knows your name? They tried. Todd returned to Beaconsfield mine for a time. Back to the same uniforms, same shifts, same hum of the underground. But everything felt different. The air wasn't the same. The noise triggered something in his chest. The laughter from other miners didn't reach his ears the same way. Brant didn't go back underground. He couldn't. Instead, he tried to find meaning in sharing the experience. He began giving talks, raw, unscripted conversations about resilience, trauma, and what it takes to stare into the void and choose life. At first, it was awkward. Then it became healing. He wasn't a polished speaker. He didn't want to be. But when he stood before a room of veterans, emergency responders, or school kids and said, "It's okay to be scared. What matters is what you do next," people listened. Still, behind the scenes, both men struggled. Brant's marriage eventually fell apart. The trauma, the fame, the pressure, it all added up. He admitted in later interviews that he spiraled, that he drank too much, that he avoided help for too long. Todd, quieter by nature, pulled inward. He focused on his kids, on his wife, on reclaiming something resembling peace, but he too carried the invisible weight. They kept in touch. Sometimes they didn't speak for months. Then one would call the other and say nothing for 10 seconds. And the other would reply, "Still here? Still here." That was all they needed. Meanwhile, Australia's mining industry was undergoing a reckoning. Regulators rolled out new safety guidelines. Seismic sensors were upgraded. Emergency training became mandatory across sectors. Protocols were rewritten. The Beaconsfield mine itself changed hands. In 2012, operations were shut down completely. The site was later converted into a museum and heritage center, part tribute, part lesson. Brant and Todd visited once. They stood near the memorial for Larry Knight. There were flowers, a helmet, a plaque. They didn't say much. Brant placed his hand on the plaque and whispered, "Still think about you, mate." Todd nodded. The wind blew softly across the gravel. Visitors walked past, recognizing them. Some asked for photos. Others simply said thank you. But the mine, now silent, didn't care for headline. It held its memories in stone. Over the years, as time passed and other stories filled the news, the Beaconsfield rescue faded from the spotlight. But for those who lived it, who watched it, who prayed during those 14 days, it never really ended. Brant and Todd weren't just survivors of a collapse. They were survivors of what comes after. The awkward fame, the broken routines, the struggle to reintegrate into a world that moved too fast. The hardest part wasn't climbing out of the mine. The hardest part was carrying what they brought back with them. The sound of silence, the memory of Larry, the image of their families waiting on the surface, the questions they still couldn't answer. And yet, they endured. They found ways to keep going, not as perfect men, but as real men. One day, Brant was speaking at a school. A teenager asked him, "Did you ever wish it never happened?" He paused, then said, "Yeah, a lot." But then he looked at the room, full of kids, quiet, listening, and added, "But I wouldn't trade what I learned about people, about what we can survive, about what matters." The boy nodded. So did the teacher. So did a janitor standing in the doorway. Because sometimes the deepest stories don't come from above the ground. Sometimes they come from where the light doesn't reach, and from those who clawed their way back toward it, inch by inch, hour by hour, with nothing but will and one another. It's been years now. Years since two men emerged from the depths of the earth, blinking into the pale Tasmanian dawn, their faces caked in sweat and dust, their bodies thin, their hearts full. Years since a mine collapsed and a town held its breath. Years since the moment Australia watched, cried, and believed again. Not in luck or fate or fairy tales, but in human endurance, in willpower, in the simple, stubborn refusal to let go. Brant Webb and Todd Russell will forever be known as the Beaconsfield Miners. But the truth is, that title is too small, because this was never just a mining story. It was a story about darkness and what it takes to survive it, about silence and the human voice that dares to echo inside it, about death and the fragile, incredible thread that can still hold two people upright when the weight of the earth is bearing down. Years later, the Beaconsfield rescue is still remembered, not for its spectacle, but for its humanity. There were no explosions, no dramatic sprints, no sensational cliffhangers, just two men, alone, alive, waiting, and a country that waited with them. It's hard to measure the legacy of something like this. Not in numbers, not in page views or broadcast time, but in people, in lives shifted. Children grew up with new role models, rescue training changed across Australia, safety culture in mining was scrutinized and reformed. A national conversation about trauma, masculinity, and mental health, especially in blue-collar industries, began to emerge in new ways. Brant and Todd never asked to be part of that, but they became part of it anyway. Their survival meant something bigger, because people saw themselves in them, not in the cage, not in the rescue tunnel, but in the fear, in the holding on, in the waiting for light, in the not knowing if someone was coming. And then, in the moment, you hear the voice through the pipe. Are you there? Yes, we're still here. That phrase became part of Australia's emotional vocabulary. It was printed on posters, quoted in speeches, whispered in homes where grief lingered. Still here. Even now, survivors of fires, floods, disease, and loss have written to Brant and Todd thanking them. Not because they saved anyone else's life, but because they proved it was possible to survive when survival felt impossible. Not without scars, not without fear, but with dignity, with strength, with tears and grit and friendship. Todd Russell stepped back from public life. He focused on family, on peace, on restoring what matters. He rarely gives interviews now, not because he's closed off, but because he knows what the world already saw was enough. Brant Webb, more public by nature, continued to speak. He opened up about the long shadow of trauma, about addiction, about losing control and rebuilding piece by piece. He became a different kind of miner, someone who digs into the human condition. In one event, he said, "We were under there for 2 weeks, but for some people, trauma lasts longer. You can't see it on a scan, but it's there, and it's real." He wasn't a therapist, but to the people in the room, he was more than that. He was someone who understood, someone who had gone where few ever go, and returned not with answers, but with presence. And sometimes, that's all you need. The mine itself is now closed. The gold is gone. The machines are silent. Where once drills echoed through tunnels, now wind brushes across rusting gates and quiet pathways. A memorial garden stands at the site, surrounded by plaques and stories. A statue of a miner holding a lantern reminds visitors of what happened here, of what was lost and what was saved. School children on field trips walk the grounds. Tourists stop to take photos. Locals still stop to reflect. And in one corner, next to a small steel cross, there's a single hand-painted sign. For Larry, for Brant, for Todd, for the ones who go down and come back different. Because this was never just about the rockfall. It was about what rockfalls do to the people inside them. Not just physically, but spiritually. Brant and Todd both said they left something behind in that pocket of air and steel. A part of themselves. Some piece of innocence, of control, of before. And they carried out something else. A new understanding of what survival costs, of what resilience means. It's not loud, it's not neat, it's not always celebrated. Sometimes it's just two people in the dark holding on saying, "If I go crazy, knock me out. If I stop breathing, you take the last water. If we get out of here, steak and a beer." That was their pact. Not a hero's oath. Just two mates refusing to let the other die alone. Today, Australia remembers them. Not with parades, not with songs, but with quiet pride. The kind that runs deep in mining towns, in families, in people who know what it means to do hard things and still go to work the next day. And what about Larry? He was never forgotten. Brant still says his name. Todd still visits the memorial. His family still holds on to the memory of a father, a husband, a mate. The stone plaque by the mine doesn't glorify or dramatize. It just tells the truth. On 25 April 2006, Larry Knight lost his life in a mine collapse. His sacrifice and the survival of his mates Brant, Webb, and Todd Russell will forever remind us of the courage that lives beneath the surface. Beneath the surface. That's where this story always lived, in the dark places, the hard places, the places most people never see, in rock, in memory, in the thin spaces between one breath and the next. It didn't need embellishment, it needed witnesses, and that's what the world became. A witness to pain, to hope, to survival. And now, almost 2 decades later, the echo of that pipe still rings. Are you there? Still here? If this story moved you, if you believe in real courage, real people, and real survival, subscribe now. This is just one of many true stories that deserve to be told. Hit that button, join our community, and never miss the moments that remind us what it means to be human.